Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. We're excited. It has been since March 2020 that we have seen actual readers sitting down in the bookstore getting ready to listen to an author. So thank you very much for coming. And our author this evening is T.J. Newman, whom I'm going to call Tori. And we'll get into her background and why she wrote the book in a moment. I'm Barbara Peters. I own the Poison Pen. We're in our 31st year. And this is our third location in Scottsdale. And we do a tremendous virtual program. So if you enjoy tonight, you can certainly watch other events or download them to podcasts. And we do have more coming up. So this is a bit of a test case. But it looks like this fall that a lot of authors are going to be coming back around in person again if the variants don't get us. So we're staying flexible. Right? Indeed. So I just flown home from Wyoming through Denver, and I read the last of Tori's book because I was sitting after going through security, which I thought was a really bad decision on my part. But on the other hand, it gave me confidence that people on the airplane knew more than we thought they did about how things work. So that's an important part of your book, isn't it?
I think so. And, I wrote a lot of it on the plane, so I kind of think it's a nice pairing. You get the sound of the hum of the engines and the call lights going off. So I think it's a good pairing to read it on the plane, although the subject matter may not be the most tranquil for that environment.
Probably better not in the Denver airport, but we'll see. Anyway, I'd like to talk to Tori at first because she has a really interesting background, which led her to write this particular book. And I know everybody wants to talk to you about being a flight attendant, but I want to talk to you about what it was like to be a bookseller.
It was heaven on earth. This is, this bookstore. My time at Changing Hands, which is where I worked before I was a flight attendant, was the time in which my lifelong dream of being a writer really turned into a concrete goal. The energy of working in a bookstore, being surrounded by books, talking about books with people who love books and are passionate about getting the right books into the right readers' hands. Hand selling is an art, and it was a joy. It was a joy to work at the bookstore, and being in that environment made me want to stay in the publishing world. I could see myself with a long future in publishing. I thought I'd stay at the store, I thought maybe I'd be a manager someday, maybe be a buyer, something like that. The opportunity to be a flight attendant came up, and my mom's a flight attendant, my sister's a flight attendant, and I felt like something I couldn't pass up, so I ended up leaving, and in a weird full circle way, it took leaving to make my way back. But the world of books is just a wonderful, I'm preaching to the choir. This is you can articulate this better than I ever could, but it's been a really interesting experience to be on the other side of publishing now and to get a look at that side as well. It's been a huge education.
I'm sure it has been. To be a successful author, you really do need to know your audience. You need to learn to know your readers and how to react to them. And so bookselling, there are not a lot of published authors who are booksellers, but they're surprisingly new. Patrick, can you remember some others?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them, really.
Jonathan Lethem, for example. And then there's some authors who've taken to owning bookstores. Ann Patchett has a bookstore. I'm trying to remember the one bookstore, Emma Straub has a bookstore in Brooklyn. One of the children's books authors, I'm trying to remember which one it is. Jeff, I think.
Larry McMurtry had a whole book town.
Yes, that's true. Larry McMurtry actually owned a town in Texas, which is like one of the biggest used books conglomerates ever. But that's different, I think for a debut author, having worked in a bookstore and connected with readers and talked to readers about what matters to them is a huge asset.
Absolutely, and I when I was working on early drafts of this, I actually went to my fellow booksellers because, like I said, nobody knows books better than booksellers, and nobody knows better than booksellers what works with readers. So I actually workshopped early drafts of my manuscript with several of my former booksellers at Changing Hands, and the feedback was gold. It was super helpful because they can see what works and what doesn't, and it was invaluable feedback.
So another Tori's previous careers, and nothing is ever wasted if you're an author. And in fact, authors do better if they've had any number of false starts or successful starts or whatever it might be, but everything is grist to your mill. I always tease Ian Rankin, who's one of my favorite authors. At one point, he was a swine group. I mean, in France. I'm serious. If you look at his resume, and you think, okay, swineherd, pigs, so whatever. But there are really some interesting stories that many authors have. Turing wanted to be in theater. And I do think, because this is a very visual book, when you read this book, probably most of you are going to see movie. You just are, And so, do you think the theater experience helped you, make this book so visual?
I do. I absolutely do. I think the way I view the world has always just been a very theatrical or cinematic viewpoint. I have a degree in musical theater, and people are always like, musical theater, that's so, okay, the singing, the dancing, and I look and I'm like, that's how I see the world. I don't know. That seems to make sense to me, and I think it all just that, growing up in theater here in the Valley, and then I studied it in college, and then when I got a job as a flight attendant, quite frankly, it's a very theatrical job. I always say that to people. It's like, look, each flight has a beginning, middle, and end, just like a play or a movie. Everyone's in costume. Certain lines at certain points. There's always going to be some sort of, inciting conflict or drama that has to be resolved within a certain period of time. It's a very, cinematic and yeah.
You're right, and there's a script. And actually, if you watch the safety films anymore, on the airlines, right, it's a whole theater experience. I mean, they do all this really fun. I think they thought nobody was ever paying attention when they stood in the aisle, buckled on the vest. So now they do it over the entertainment system.
Absolutely. The airline that I worked for, they had a whole music video that was and going back to that, the musical theater. I'm like, this safety video is what I envision. When we're telling you to put the life vest on and to do this, it's like,
that's how it is. Well, I do think you might think it's an oxymoron for me to say that this is a visual book, because that's not really supposed to be how books are. They're supposed to be premise and the written word. But I think you can't help but see these scenes. Have all of you flown? I mean, I used to think everybody had, but then I've learned that that's not always true. So most of you here have actually been on a plane. I know, but seriously, I took what was it, Patrick? Like in 2011. I thought it would be nice to take the Poison Pen staff to Alaska, where I was going to be a Lifetime Achievement Award winner at a big mystery convention. And to my surprise, very few of our staff have passports. One of them didn't even want a passport. And I thought, you just can't assume, from your own life that everybody is like you. So.
And I always thought that when I had someone on the plane, like an adult who it was their first flight, their first time flying, loved it, because it was the first time. We're so used to flying that the magic of it is lost on most people, and so to see an adult be excited and look around with wonder at this idea that we're in the metal tube flying through the air and not knowing what it's going to feel like to take off. It's I always loved watching people who's
You're not old enough, but flying used to really be glamorous. I can remember flying from Chicago, where I grew up, Winnetka, to Palo Alto to look at Stanford to see if I was going to go there on the old Constellations. Everybody got dressed up. We put on heels. The seats were such that, you had a table, you'd have like 2 seats and then 2 more seats so that you were all facing each other around the table, and they put real tablecloths on them and actual silver, and they served you, lunch or whatever it was, and it was really glamorous. And now, everybody's showing up in their pajamas or, whatever, and flying has become basically like buses, I mean, largely it's just mass travel, but the glamour of flying is to a great degree gone away.
Definitely. I grew up, my mom was a flight attendant, like I said, and so I grew up with non-rev travel benefits, because it's a perk of when you work in an airline, that's the perk. But there was a dress code. And so growing up, we wore pantyhose and, little ballet slippers and, your Sunday school dress every time we took a flight, and you'd be looking around at the people in their jeans and leggings, and it was like, Must be nice.
And everybody smoked, and that was not great. But anyway, I had a. What was my thought? Say something. Perk of old age here. What? I actually just want to do something about fun. One of the things that Tori does really well in this book, and it's hard to talk about this book without giving things away, but using the actual bits of the airplane as weapons, pro and con, I thought was really, I'm never going to feel quite the same way about going to the restroom on the plane. Many of you may think of the Mile High Club, which I will edit for the benefit of our junior audience here tonight, but you would probably realize that physically you'd have to be a contortionist to belong to the Mile High Club in today's restaurants. in today's airplanes. But I thought it was just wonderful what you did with them. So when you read the book, you'll be able to find out how interesting all of it is. Good for you.
Thank you. It's kind of fun because, we all, as everyone here, we've already determined, knows an airplane and has a relationship with it, but to be able to write it from the person who basically lived on an aircraft, you're there all day, every day, the things that are passing in experience we have a lot of experience with it, so it's kind of fun to, like you said, maybe give a different viewpoint to the bathroom or to the back alley or something like that.
So you're a new audience, so I can tell you, after so bored with the story, because I tell it, but I love this story. We did an event some years ago for a very nice man who it turned out made his whole career writing books in other people's names. And he was there to do an event about one book. And we were up in Cave Creek at the library up there. And as I arrived and was putting out the books, I realized that virtually all the women walking in were in Pan American stewardess uniforms. This wasn't that long ago either. And I thought, seriously, why are we doing this? And it turned out that this lovely man wrote that famous bestseller, Coffee, Tea, or Me. He wrote it with a female name, and, it turned into a bestseller. I don't know if you've ever run across it, but it's one of the early airplane books, right? And then it was so successful, this part I love the most, he wrote 6 more under his female pseudonym, but he dedicated every single one of the books to himself under his name. So if anybody had been paying attention, they would have worked it out. But it was so much fun to see all of those uniforms, because Pan Am was a really stylish airline. Yeah. They had those really nifty flat hats. And
the memorabilia from back then is just, you can go on eBay and see it all there. It's just stunning. And my mom, I'm bringing it up again, but she's got some of her old uniforms, and we've got memorabilia going all the way back. It's beautiful.
So to write falling, you made up an airline, because probably wouldn't be a terribly good idea to actually use a real airline for this book.
I don't think I'd go over very well.
No.
I don't think I'd get many permissions for that.
So if you were making up your ideal airline, what qualities would you endow it with?
Probably something similar to what Coastal Airways is, which is, Coastal Airways is kind of modeled off of a lot of the amenities that you're seeing now in aviation, which will be interesting to see after the pandemic, what's been taken away and what comes back. Service forward and entertainment forward, tech forward. That was a big leap when we went to having Wi-Fi on board every aircraft, which in the book is both a saving grace and an Achilles heel. And the same thing with food, with service. I think that would be the type of airline that I would like to see. Something that makes flying enjoyable again, and not just that bus experience like you were talking about.
If they enable cell phone talking, I have had my last flight. I am really not going to sit there and be a prisoner of somebody else's conversation on speakerphone. Trains most often have now silent, compartments or cell phone compartments. I can't remember which it is, where you absolutely have to talk. You're forced to go in there and close the door. But you can't really do that on an airplane. I don't see how
I guess you could try in the bathroom, but again, I don't know why you'd want to.
I wouldn't want to spend any length of time in one of the airplane bathrooms if I could afford it. Right. But anyway, the tech part is really interesting, and having just flown back from Denver, now instead of giving you entertainment over like the little screens and all, you're supposed to enable your own. So they now assume that everybody flying has a cell phone or an iPad with it. It's almost impossible, I think, to fly right now. Given the security concerns and the way, the tickets and all the rest of it, I can't. I mean, I sometimes print mine out because I'm still old school. Everybody looks at me in this kind of disparaging way, when I have my little paper ticket. I'm still not 100% sure my cell phone's not going to blow up when I put it on there, whatever. But I said to my husband, it assumes everybody flying can read. I mean, we are a literate society, but nonetheless, there's an absolute presumption that in order to go through an airport, you have to be able to read in the language where the primary language, although sometimes they give you two. But you basically, have to have a device in order to get all the information in the whole bit. So that's a big change.
That is a big change, especially if you fly international too. It's always a trip landing somewhere, and English is usually available. But I've flown into some Asian countries where I'm just like, could somebody help me out here? I really don't. I'm really not sure.
I have flown to Tokyo on Japanese Airlines where everything is in Japanese. They just assume you're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah.
And you do.
You do.
Yeah.
You figure it out. Yeah.
So you decided to write a thriller. What did you know about writing a thriller? It's a particular form of fiction. Why a thriller?
I love thrillers. I'm a child of the 90s, and I grew up reading and watching, those big blockbuster, Jurassic Park, Twister, those types of stories. That's what I love. Those are the stories that I enjoy. And I think as I got older, I realized that you don't have time to read everything, so you kind of narrow in on what you spend your time with. And I also realized that all of the stories that I wanted to tell were thrillers. I didn't necessarily set out to do that. It just was one of those coincidences that I noticed sort of after the fact of like, oh, there's a common thread here that I'm now noticing. All of my stories have this, fast-paced, twisting, turning type thriller mentality. And when I came up with the idea for this book, it was just, there was no other way to tell this story except in this sort of big cinematic, twisting way.
So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, the thriller is generally, think of it as combat. It takes a protagonist, a protagonist and an antagonist. And it's all about the struggle. You usually know who the bad guy is, from the beginning. It isn't like a mystery where you're trying to work out who the killer could be among umpteen suspects. And it has forward motion because it travels rather than staying in a stationary spot. So in this case, everybody's inside the airplane, but not everybody, because we'll get to that in a minute. There are other parts of the book. But to write a great thriller, you have to set up a predicament. You put people into it. How are they going to get out of it? Who's going to win? And then to really have a great thriller, you've got to have a great villain. You just have to have a protagonist that makes it worth doing. So you had all those things, but I'm not sure that you thought of them sequentially. I think the story probably brought them to you.
Absolutely. I wrote this. This is a plot-centered book, and normally with something like that, you would plot it ahead of time and have a blueprint and a roadmap and know where you're going with this. And I definitely just started writing, which made for a real interesting revision and editing process afterwards. The scene in the cockpit where Captain Hoffman first learns the predicament that his family is in, that's the only thing I knew. That's the concept of the book. It was the only thing I knew, so I started there and then just started writing. I probably should have spent a little bit more time fleshing out ahead of time because, like I said, the revision process, I wrote over 30 drafts of this before all was said and done, and it probably would have been a little bit easier, and I'm discovering this with my second book to kind of have a roadmap before I get started. Would have been a little bit easier if I would have known where I was headed ahead of time. But everybody, the characters, they came up on their own. Some of the characters came completely formed. I've said this before, the flight attendants, they came to my mind completely formed as they were. From the first draft to the final draft, they never wavered. They were exactly who they were. And there was a lot of the book that was like that. And like I said, I wrote, over 30 drafts of this, but it was really interesting to see when I got to the final draft, I was referencing the first draft for notes, and I was going back to my, original research source material to pull into there the end of the line. And that was a really, really nice view to see that even though I made so many changes and it evolved so much, that the core and root of what this story was, who these characters were and what it was about, it never changed.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know where my voice is going. In an airplane hostage thing, if you think back to like D.B. Cooper, is that the guy's name? Remember the famous? So, it was usually about money, capture the airplane and make everybody pay ransom. Or I think there was at least one where it was political asylum, or they wanted to divert the plane to, that kind of thing. But you always supposed that the object of the person taking the plane hostage was to live through it. Or in D.B. Cooper's case, to jump out of it. We don't know whatever happened to him. But, all that changed with 9/11. Although, if we thought back to World War II, those of us who can remember it, there were kamikaze pilots, Japanese who turned airplanes into weapons. That was one of the ways that they fought the end of the Pacific War. So when this comes up, we're not going to tell you, but your first question is, what is going on here? Is this, an airplane for ransom? Is this, trying to get a group of people somewhere that otherwise could not go? Is it a pilot suicide like the Malaysian flight, which they pretty much worked out, was the pilot or the guy in Germany? Or what else is going on? And, do these people want to live through what they've created, or don't they care? So those are all questions that come up. We're not going to tell them, right? Otherwise, there would be no point reading the book. But I think you have to think about it. So you, as the author, needed to be thinking about those questions when you started writing it.
I did, yeah, and also, like you said, September 11th changed everything. And there's a scene in the book where there's sort of a lull in the action, and so they're waiting. So the flight attendants are talking, and they say to one another, "Remember what they used to teach us about hijackings and how we used to respond?" And the tactic used to be gain their empathy. Because usually there's a want, usually there's a reason that people are doing something like this. So if you can gain their empathy, if you can show them, they were instructed to, flight attendants used to be instructed to carry pictures of their family with them in their badge so that you can engage, the hijacker, skyjacker in conversation and get them empathetic towards your situation, and then maybe they'll think twice about what they're doing. When September 11th happened, everything changed. The tactics, the way their flight attendants are taught to handle situations, everything changed. So in the book, it really is sort of it's approach from a current approach to situations like that, which is by any means necessary. You do what you have to do to protect the aircraft and protect the passengers.
So a lot of the book obviously takes place in the airplane, but there are other parts of this story. So talk to us about the pilot and the pilot's family, because his wife and his children are also at risk in this operation, which I thought was added a lot of tension, and also is the reason the pilot, is in the terrible dilemma that he's in. It isn't really about him.
Right. It's overall the variations of the book. One of the last major changes that happened was I really fleshed out and beefed up the storyline of the family on the ground. And really, it's almost three viewpoints. You've got the plane and you've got the ground, but even within the plane, you have the demarcation of the cockpit door. Because once that door shuts, you've got the pilots on one side, you've got the flight attendants and the passengers on another, and everybody's basically left to their own devices. There's very little communication. And so it was almost like three viewpoints in that sort of way. And it was fun to toggle back and forth, to do the intercutting between the ground and the air. That was a really fun skill to learn that I wasn't great at in the beginning. And a way that I got better was I cut out, I would print up the beats of the story and everything that had happened, and I would cut it up into little pieces, and then I would tape it to the wall and move it around like a puzzle. This is when I'm talking about my revision process that was sloppy and backwards, and I should have done this from the beginning. But I moved things around like a puzzle until it made sense, and I did that several times over the course of the revision process of this book, because the intercutting, I thought, was good. It's like a modified locked room thriller, right? Because it's parts of it are locked room. Well, that's a fairly self-explanatory name, but yeah, so it was kind of a modified version of that, and it was fun to learn that skill of intercutting back and forth, and that helped keep the pace as quick as I could keep it.
Well, if it'll make you feel better, there's a very experienced best-selling author who is often in our bookstore, and who actually printed out things and then laid them all the way down a long hallway, and then walked up and down, moving the papers around to try to get it. So even an author of experience does have to, to work out, if you've got two different things going on, how to put them together. It's called TikTok, and are you a reader? Can you be really annoyed if you're not sure who's speaking? If you've got more than one point of view and it shifts, don't you need something or other that sort of says to you, okay, we're moving from this narrator to this narrator, and so you don't go crazy? Right. And if it's too short, that can be annoying, but if it's too long, then you can lose it. I mean, it's really hard to do it well.
Yeah, it was a skill I definitely learned. It was that aspect of this kind of writing was not innate. It was something that I had to look at constantly. And when I started working with Shane Salerno, my agent, who has a background primarily in film, he helped me understand and see, like, how are you punching in and how are you punching out of your chapters? Basically, how are you finishing a chapter so that the writer has to turn the page, has to know what happens next, can't feel comfortable just putting the bookmark in and setting the book down. And then how do you start a chapter so that once they've turned that page and they've started, well, now I can't just know, I gotta keep going.
The Perils of Pauline, an old movie standard, right? You get to the cliffhanger and then you have to show up for the next chapter. Although I think those were like Saturdays. I think you went and saw it Saturday, then the next Saturday you'd see another. She's hanging over the cliff, whatever it may be. Your agent, this book has been sold to the movies, and you can imagine when you read it, it'll be a really interesting movie. Sort of along Die Hard lines, maybe, but other stuff. I loved. Did you see Die Hard? Y'all watched it? I thought the second one that takes place in the airport was the most satisfying, because I just loved the very last bit. I won't spoil it for those who haven't seen it, but if you've never watched a Die Hard movie, watch the second one, and it's the end. I mean, it's the last 20 seconds of that movie that's the giant payoff. I absolutely loved it, but. This will definitely be a movie, but we've left out a group. You've got the family, you've got the pilots, you've got the passengers, and the airline attendants. But we also have some law enforcement and ground support, and eventually perhaps even higher up figures that are going to have to make some decisions too. So you've really got 4 groups that have a stake in this story, right?
Yeah, and the FBI storyline, that was when I was saying that I really had to sort of flesh out the ground storyline. That was when I decided to get the FBI involved in a far more human name and a face, Theo Baldwin, and he became sort of the leading perspective from the FBI. And once I made that change, everything just really fully clicked. I think it was a imbalance of plot that I didn't recognize until I had a professional like Shane come in and say, it's great, but we need to this part just needs to be, pumped up just a little bit. Yeah.
So if any of your wannabe writers don't ever get discouraged, because Drury had 40-some rejections before somebody read the book and saw the potential in it. It was clearly not completely finished and polished and ready to go, but was willing to work to make that happen. And there are a lot of stories like that. Over the years, Patrick, haven't we? We've had a lot of authors say, I had 69 rejections, or, not every... A book is never done until it's published. Oftentimes I read manuscripts. I used to edit books. I've edited probably 800 books by now, something like that. And, where it is when you first start with it isn't necessarily where it is when you read it. There are a lot of things that go on in the course of a book. As long as it hasn't yet been printed and put into your hands, you can keep changing it, right up till... Although publishers are really ugly. If you try to do that at the very end, after they've done all the typesetting and everything, they charge you a lot of money per page if you decide you want to fix something. So,
and that was a huge learning experience for me, because this is my first book.
Right.
This is the first time I've ever taken a story, into this kind of publication. And you're right, it's never done. It seems like it's never finished. And I actually try not to pick up the finished book too often and look through it, because I always feel the instinct to grab a pen and start making changes. Just at a certain point, I guess I'm learning at least that you just kind of got to let it go.
If you want to be a published author, yes, that's the key. At some point, you do have to let it go. Otherwise, it could be a work in progress for your entire life. There's a wonderful thriller writer named Jeffrey Deaver, who's here almost with all of his books, has been for years and years. And he once said that if they would allow him, he would hang by his heels on a trapeze over a press and make changes while it was moving along. But, so yeah, it is interesting, and it does take somebody with a vision to help you, like your agent. Most agents don't really do all that, but in this particular case, I know him well. He does like to develop stories and does this kind of thing. So he's as much an editor as he is an agent.
And I was so grateful for that, because, I worked so hard for so long on this, and I started querying agents at the point that I felt like I had taken the story as far as I could on my own. So that's the point at which I started seeking representation. And once I got my 40-second submission, my one and only yes, and once he started... I don't know. I always wonder how he was able to see through the flaws to what the book could be.
He's a movie guy. I see it. I mean, he took one look at that and he said, "Oh my God, it's a movie." And seriously, I do. Shane, you watching? You'll probably write to me when this is over. But this is going to be my guess: is that he really did see the movie potential, and then books are not movies, but you can make it all work. Any of you watch Bosch, for example? All right, so the books are different. Michael has spliced together bits and pieces of the books and things. There are characters in them that are different. But the books are still the same. The books are still the books, regardless of what happens in the filming of them. They're just different. Lots of people say, "Oh, the movie wasn't as good as the book." Well, you know what? It's different than the book. But the book didn't change. It's still there. So, and then you get iterations like, you see Rebecca back in 1938, whatever that great cast was, and then, there's a more modern version of Rebecca, and it's a different movie. But the book is still the book that Dashi Doria wrote and published in 1938. It didn't change, so.
And I just can't believe that the film rights have evolved at all. Like, the fact that it could be a movie someday is just...
Right, and it's not automatic. Just because somebody bought film rights doesn't mean there ever will be a movie. There's a ton of stuff that has to go on. And particularly today, they always have to attach some name actor in order to, get the sort of box office result that they want. Do you have questions? This is publication date, so, sorry, a toast to you on your publication date. So I'm going to assume that very few of you have had a chance to read it, and we'll kill you if you tell us anything about the book anyway. But aside from all that, do any of you have questions that you might like to ask Tori about anything?
Who can you envision playing the pilot?
I have them in my mind, but they're the completely fictitious characters that I came up with, and I got asked that because the movie may become a movie. People ask me all the time, who would you cast, who would you? And honestly, I I'm more interested to see what other people think, what they say, because sometimes it really surprises me, and sometimes I'm like, that's how that character came off to you? Interesting. And then it makes me want to go back and figure out where am I writing that I gave that impression. So yeah, I haven't cast it yet in my mind.
Maybe they'll ask you. So.
You know, I'm just excited. No, yeah,
Not usually. No, it's about star power. You know, I mean, for any of you who watched, you know, the first Jack Reacher movie, you know, many people just couldn't imagine Tom Cruise's Jack Reacher, aside from the foot and more difference in height. But Lee said a really interesting thing when we talked to him about it once at a big event. He said at the time that it was thought to be the Jack Reacher movie, there were no tall leading men that had any star power. There just weren't any. So it turned out to be Tom Cruise. But now it's being made for television, and they have cast it with somebody who, for Reacher fans, is going to be more acceptable, you know, in terms of just how he fits the characterization.
Yeah.
So, who knows?
But I'm also just excited to see, so what you were saying, like the differences between a book and a movie, if it does get made into a movie, I'd love to see it just put in another set of creative hands and see what they come up with and see. I don't necessarily feel like, because the movies are oftentimes very different from the book, and I don't know, I'd be interested to see the changes and say, okay, how does this work better for the film, you know, since you're the professionals at that. I'd love to see how they do make the changes.
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting. Does anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
What kept you going after 41 rejections and then you hit a grand slam? I mean, what kept you moving that way?
Wanting it. It was hard. I felt every single one of those rejections. Yeah, I felt every single one of those rejections. But I kept saying to myself that I didn't come this far just to come this far. And I knew that if I didn't pursue it as far as I could, I would always regret it. I would always know that maybe the next one was the yes.
Sometimes rejections come with healthy comments, helpful comments. You know, an editor might say, you know, it's not for us, or if this were different, or, you know, it lacks this and that. So rejections can, in a way, be a learning experience, even though they're really hard to take. So that would depend. Yes, ma'am, I see a hand way back there.
I'm interested in...
It's you. Hi.
Hi, Barbara. What are you hearing from the industry? What are you hearing from pilots and flight attendants? I know it's publication based, so they probably haven't read it, but what sort of feedback, if any, have you gotten?
You know, the feedback that I get consistently, which is really wonderful, as a former flight attendant myself, I think you can read this and definitely feel my reverence for aviation in general, but particularly the role of the flight attendant. It's been really gratifying to hear, not just from former coworkers, but also from just general public who are reading this, people whose perspective on the role of the flight attendant has been broadened, and that their respect for the position has increased. I think people think we're on board for service, and that's it. And it's really nice to have that response of people saying, I didn't know you guys were so well trained. I didn't know you had so much ability to do so much. It has really increased my respect for flight attendants, and it's really nice to hear.
Am I right in thinking that some early flight attendants actually were nurses or had medical training? I'm pretty sure that used to be way back in the day a requirement.
Yes.
And they're not just glorified waiters, you know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that hopefully you never have to see because your flight went smoothly. But, you know, if you take international flights, for example, there's a lot more work about how to evacuate the plane into the water, you know, how the rafts work, how, you know, all that kind of stuff. They don't do that. I mean, from Phoenix to Denver, there's no water, so there's no really great point in telling you how it goes. But I do a lot of long-haul flying all over the world, and, you know, it's a much more elaborate scenario.
Well, and even for domestic flight attendants, we do actually have training in the ditching and the water evacuations. Yeah, more extensive in the international flying when you're doing the extended over water flying. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but if you're flying out of O'Hare, for example, you know, it's just Lake Michigan is right there.
Right. Right.
And, you know, New York airports, I mean, you know, JFK's right there on the water. Boston's right there on the water. San Diego, if any of you have ever gotten stuck in the fog in San Diego because they closed the airport.
Yeah,
So,
ask Sully. I mean, he'd say, you know, there's bodies of water even in Manhattan.
that's such a great story. And, you know, I think that whole story about Captain Sullenberger is just a remarkable story, and it was an interesting movie, too. But what a great thing that he did, bringing that plane down in the Hudson. And, you know, and they tried to question his judgment, and he had, like 2 seconds to decide what he was going to do. I mean, you know.
And it's fun if you ever have a free time and just want to entertain yourself. You can go on YouTube and you can Google like the transcript of the air traffic control and cockpit conversation, and they have it all right there, and you can listen to it. It's absolutely fascinating because you know, you've got a pilot who's literally saying, "I am about to land an aircraft with 150 passengers on it on the Hudson River." I mean, this is high stakes, and their voices are just as even as can be. Just air traffic control and pilots, that's how they're trained.
It was helpful that he was an old school pilot, because there was a subsequent disaster where an airplane went down, and it was a younger pilot, and they said he didn't have any experience flying without instruments. He just didn't know. So they were lucky that it was Sully, who actually was more old school and who knew how to deal with it, because, you know, computer's not always going to help you. In a moment. It's kind of like driving one of these new cars. I love it that my mirrors beep at me and say, "No, stupid, don't, you know, get into the right lane," and all the rest of it. But, you know, in the end, you still do need to have some basic car skills, right? Yep. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
How many versions of the front page picture did you go through before you selected this one?
The cover, when they sent me the image of the cover, like, "Hey, this is what we're thinking about, what do you think?" And I opened it on my computer and I just stared at the screen for like 5 minutes. It was striking.
It is. You know, there's an animated version where the airplane goes up and down.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what makes the cover so interesting, is that you can see it.
Does that cover cost more money?
I don't think it's, you know, it would be fun to actually, I was sort of wishing I had one here, we could do that, but.
Actually, that's a good idea, like a hologram.
Yeah. Now I was watching,
Okay.
there people make video book trailers for books now to sell them. They also do TikTok on books. I haven't progressed from Instagram to TikTok yet, I'm just not ready for that. But anyway, in one of them, they show the cover and the airplane is, you know, sliding up and down, and I thought that was so cool. It is a great design.
And
But-
we made lots of, we made lots of different variations. You know, let's try it with these colors, or a different font, or this bigger, or that smaller, but we went with the very first draft of it.
Just in case, authors don't have much to say about titles or covers. Those are publisher decisions, so authors are really lucky when they like their cover, and it works out well. But Tori, it's a courtesy thing to ask the author, but the truth is they're going to do it. That's just the way it is. The publisher actually owns the copyright on the production, so, you know, the way the typeset of the book and the whole bit doesn't belong to the author, it belongs to the publisher.
So do you like the cover?
I love the cover.
Yeah, it's a great cover.
I think it's
With hologram potential, which we should all keep in mind. Did you have a comment, sir?
Yeah, did you get goosebumps? Did you get goosebumps when you saw the size of your ad in the New York Times book review that came out this week, which is what got me interested?
I'm so thrilled to know
It's
that.
this big.
It's huge, yeah. It's a 2-page spread in the New York
Right.
Times book review. It's pretty incredible. There's been a lot of goosebumps moments on this journey, and that was definitely one of them.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, do you get worried that some wacko get ideas from your book?
I think that I'm a flight attendant with an overactive imagination, and I'm very confident that the people that get paid to and spend their lives making sure that the domestic airspace is safe, I'm pretty sure they're way ahead of me.
Patrick?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you get together with your colleagues in the same industry, I bet you guys have some horror stories or some war stories.
About the passengers or about the airplane?
Just about, I know you've probably seen a whole lot.
We've got battle scars for sure. And you know, my mom is a flight attendant, my sister was a flight attendant, so you know, when we would get together for family dinner, it was a lot of, you know, war stories and comparisons that way too. Yeah, we were never at a, you know, a loss for a good story.
Has your conception of distance been altered forever by being a flight attendant? It's kind of an esoteric question, but you know, you spend breakfast in Phoenix and lunch in Dallas and going all over the place.
Absolutely. There's a very senior turn, meaning you go somewhere and come back, you don't stay overnight. And I was based in Los Angeles, and there was a very senior turn. It's an industry that's based on seniority, meaning, you know, if you've been there the longest, you get the better trips. And these trips you could hardly get your hands on if you were junior. That was a DC turn. So you start in LA, fly to Washington, DC, and then fly back in the same day. And every once in a while when I would do a DC turn, it would always kind of strike me this moment of, I just flew literally from coast to coast across the country and back and made it home in time for dinner. Like, this is, it's wild when you think about it like that. Yeah, the spatial, the time, yeah, it changes your perspective.
You know, the other thing too, and I didn't think about it, we did an event a little while ago. One of the great things about Zoom is we've done all kinds of events about things that never occurred to me to do before. Owls of the Eastern Ice, you know, I did the event because I know a little Russian. I've been to Russia. But we did Sir Roderick Flood is a Oxford professor of economics, and he wrote a book called England's Magnificent Gardens, and it's not so much about the gardens, although he loves them, it's about the economic impact that the gardening industry has in England and for tourism and for all kinds of things. And at one point he brought out a drawing of, I don't think it was Blenheim, but something similar, one of the really large British gardens that covers acres and acres with different kinds of things. And the 17th or 18th century, probably Capability Brown or somebody like him, who had drawn the plans, had managed to imagine what it would be like to be looking down as though he were in an airplane or a drone. But Sir Roderick pointed out that no one in the 18th century had ever been able to do that. So if you fly and you're used to looking down at the landscape, you know, you're all kind of used to that aerial perspective, but that is a very new thing, to be able to look at the world from above down with any accuracy. And didn't you think that was interesting, Patrick, when you made that comment? I was thinking about how much I love to, you know, flying over the, you know, Greenland or something. It's just so exciting. You see the, you know, the colors of the ice and all the other great stuff that happens. But we've only been able to do that, you know, with flight.
And that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, you know, when you have a passenger on board who's never flown before, it's like, that thought had never occurred to me, that, you know, that sort of bird's eye view is a relatively new viewpoint.
Until we had a bird, an actual metal bird to go up in. And I'm sure that's why people want to go out into space. You know, if you really think, well, why is Jeff Bezos going to, you know, fly up in space and stay there with any luck? But nonetheless, I'm just echoing other booksellers. I've never really regarded Amazon as a problem. But I'm sure it's that perspective of being able to look back on Earth. Have any of you seen, you know, the images that they've sent back from the space station and other stuff, you know? Just really cool. Well, sorry, one more question. Yes, sir.
Just one quicker. Did you keep your napkins?
You mean like what I scribble notes on? Oh yeah, I've got a whole Tupperware container just full of notes and random things. Yeah, I kept a lot of it. A lot of it also made it into hotel trash cans, because I would write everything by hand on the plane, and then I'd go to the layover or go to a coffee shop, and I'd transfer everything to my iPad and my keyboard, and then discard it. You know, so there's a lot of hotel trash cans that had a lot of the notes of this book too.
What a triumph that your handwriting is so good that you could do that. If I wrote notes to myself on napkins on a plane, it would be completely unintelligible. So good for you. You must have great handwriting. Yes, ma'am.
What are you working on next?
It wasn't two book deals, so I am working on my second book.
You don't have to say it, it's too soon.
Yeah, I'm going to play it as close to the chest as I played the first one. I didn't tell many people what I was doing at all. I didn't tell many people in my life at all that I was writing a book. the first time around, and I'm kind of doing it the second time around. It feels less scary that way. You know, it feels like I can take the risk and take the chance on my own privately, and if it doesn't work, then nobody needs to know about that terrible scene that I can't believe I thought was going to work. They didn't.
Nobody's grading your homework. Christina, did you have a final question back there?
Do you have a favorite? I know your book is plot driven, but do you have a favorite character?
I'm partial to Joe. Joe's the lead flight attendant. I think if I had to choose a favorite, and I'm not sure you're ever supposed to choose a favorite of your children, Joe would probably be my favorite character.
She's the closest to your own point of view, right?
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all for being a wonderful audience. It's so exciting to have you here. Thank you very much for coming out. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.